Hello, everyone. I'm Quita Highsmith, Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Genentech, and we're excited to be sponsoring this session to create a space for leaders and experts to discuss the importance of corporate social responsibility just 1 year after the tragic death of George Floyd. This past year has not been easy for our community, and at Genentech, we've seen that employees want us to take action to address societal wrongs. And in this moment, for us as leaders to have tough, important conversations internally and ensure that all employees and teams are feeling included and supported. Since 2017, Genentech has worked to increase diverse representation in our clinical trials. But this past year challenged us to ask ourselves, are we doing enough work in our own house? Because real change starts at home. And in an effort to be more intentional and transparent about making real change, this year, for the first time on our external website, we released our first ever Diversity and Inclusion Annual Report and our 2025 D&I commitments. Genentech has also committed $42 million through our corporate and employee giving programs and the Genentech Foundation to help address the devastating impact of COVID-19 on communities of color by providing a wide range of investments to assist in low-income households and communities of color that have been hard hit by the health and economic impacts of the pandemic. This has to be more than a moment. It has to be an inclusion movement with our goal to be proactive, build trust, magnify our efforts as change agents, and put diversity and inclusion front and center. I hope you have a very productive and bold meeting.
Hello, and welcome to our National Racial Equity Initiative Annual Legislative Conference Session. My name is Olajumoke Obayanju, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of the National Racial Equity for Social Justice here at CBCF. During today's session, a movement or a moment analyzing corporate responsibility 1 year after the death of George Floyd, we will engage in conversation with corporate leaders who will offer insight on how their organizations have remained dedicated to their commitment towards racial equity. But importantly, we will cultivate a space to discuss proactive next steps. Last year's unjust killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd sparked a national movement towards racial equity. And in response, many corporations produced statements, launched initiatives, and reformed internal practices to demonstrate their support for the Black Lives Matter movement and solidarity with the Black community. Today, we will discuss best practices undertaken by companies to help advance racial equity from a public policy perspective. And we'll also dive into the question, are companies today truly invested in efforts to advance racial equity, or instead are they mostly motivated by the perception of their impact to boost their brand? I am thrilled to introduce Congressman Hank Johnson, who will open today's session with remarks. Rep. Johnson is in his 8th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Georgia's 4th Congressional District. He has distinguished himself as a substantive, effective lawmaker and a leading national progressive voice. A senior member of House Judiciary Committee, Rep. Johnson has introduced, co-sponsored, and passed legislation to level the playing field for everyday Americans. His bills that protect consumers and citizens' civil liberties include the FAIR Act and the Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act, SMLEA. SMLEA is a part of the historic George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was the Congressional Black Caucus's response to police and vigilante violence against African Americans across the country. In January 2021, Rep. Johnson was named as a member of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, the main investigative committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. Prior to taking his seat in Congress in 2006, Rep. Johnson practiced criminal defense law in Georgia for 27 years. He also served 12 years as a magistrate judge and 5 years as a county commissioner. Please help me welcome Congressman Hank Johnson.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Congressman Hank Johnson, representing Georgia's 4th Congressional District. And I'm honored to welcome you to this important session hosted by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation as part of our annual legislative conference. This National Racial Equity Initiative session, entitled A Movement or a Moment, analyzing corporate responsibility 1 year after the death of George Floyd, is precisely the conversation we need to have at this time. Last year's brutal and tortured murder of George Floyd, along with the killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and others, made undeniably clear to the world the fact that police brutality and systemic racism are facts of life in America, and that racial injustice must be rooted out of every enterprise of American life. At the same time as the horrible killing of George Floyd, the Black community was being disproportionately ravaged with sickness, hospitalization, and death due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this reality caused a national awareness of the connection between race and economic inequality. The police and the pandemic sparked a movement towards racial equality in America, and we must not allow that movement to devolve into simply a moment. In response to the nationwide demand for justice and equity, many corporations established policies that produced social responsibility initiatives to increase diversity and inclusion, and announced reformation of their internal practices to demonstrate their support for the Black Lives Matter movement and solidarity with the Black community. According to a 2019 survey conducted by the Markstein and Curtis Insights, 46% of consumers pay close attention to a brand's social justice efforts before purchasing a product, and 70% of consumers want to know what the brands they support are actually doing to address social issues. Companies are part of our social fabric, and it's critical for consumers to know whether companies are truly invested in efforts to advance racial equity, or instead are they mostly motivated by the need for a cheap marketing strategy. Corporate responsibility is not just a nice sounding phrase. It is essential to a more just, healthy, and prosperous country. And it is absolutely essential to achieving racial equity. America's companies, large and small, must lead by example and must be part of the solution. And that is why I'm so grateful to the CBCF for hosting this session, and to this outstanding panel, including Google and Warner Music Group, as well as our fantastic moderator, Kimberly Merchant, from the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. Thank you for sharing your perspectives, and thank you to the audience for taking the time to join us for this important conversation.
Today's discussion will be moderated by Kimberly Merchant, Director of the Racial Justice Institute at the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. As the first ever Racial Justice Institute Director, Kimberly Merchant leads and provides strategic oversight for the Racial Justice Institute and its expanding advocacy network. Ms. Merchant comes to the Shriver Center with 20 years of experience practicing law. Most recently, she served as the director of the Mississippi Center for Justice's Educational Opportunities Campaign, where among other initiatives, she spearheaded efforts to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline. In addition to being a W.K. Kellogg Foundation Community Leadership Network Fellow, she holds a number of leadership roles in her local community, serving on the Board of Trustees for the Greenville Public School District, as president of the Washington County Community Foundation, and as chair of the City of Greenville's Election Commission. Ms. Merchant is an alumna of the Shriver Center's Racial Justice Institute and has since served as a faculty member, a coach and mentor, and a member of the Advisory Council. Ms. Merchant is a native of Pascagoula, Mississippi, and attended the University of Southern Mississippi, receiving a Bachelor of Science in English, and the University of Mississippi School of Law, where she received her JD. Before turning it over to the moderator, I'd like to thank our panelists and our CBC member, Rep. Hank Johnson, for lending their time today. Thank you for being a part of this important conversation. Ms. Merchant, we are so thrilled to have you, and I will turn it over to you and start the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm really pleased to be here. And I'm going to start this discussion with two fabulous panelists. I'm going to begin with Dr. Maurice Stinnett, who is the Global Head of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion with Warner Music. Dr. Stinnett is an experienced leader and expert in the areas of diversity, inclusion, and equity across corporate, nonprofit, and education sectors. He serves as Global Head of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Warner Music Group, a leader in global music entertainment. In his role, he spearheads the company's equity initiatives and implements tailored strategies and programs designed to cultivate a diverse and inclusive company culture. Dr. Stinnett previously made history as the inaugural Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for BSC Global, owner of Barclays Center and the NBA's Brooklyn Nets, where he provides leadership and support across BSC brands. Dr. Stinnett was the first Black man to be appointed Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for an NBA team. Dr. Stinnett is an energetic presenter who is a fierce advocate for equity and inclusion. He's been recognized for his work by various organizations, including receiving the Jackie Robinson Trailblazer Award from Reverend Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push Coalition and being named the Responsible 100 Corporate Leader List by City and State of New York. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Business from Central State University, a Master of Diversity from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a Master of Education and Doctor of Education in Organizational Leadership for Columbia University. Thank you, Dr. Stinnett, for being here with us today. I want to begin by talking about the billions of dollars that have been poured into communities designed to both attack the systemic racism that we see today, as well as all of the efforts that are being made by corporations internally in terms of hiring quotas, increasing diversity in response to what we've seen over the last couple of years. Can you share with us what initiatives your corporation has done in those efforts?
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I thank all of the everyone involved in the invitation and my other colleague who was on here, the panelists. But yeah, I mean, we started off, we were the first organization in the music industry, but one of the first organizations to launch the $100 million social justice fund. And so that was our response immediately, saying, and I wasn't even with the organization at that time when they did that. They knew they had to do something substantive, significant, and to put it out into the market that we're on the move. And so they immediately said, let's get some money, and committed between the Blavatnik Foundation and Warner Music Group $100 million. And then they went out and assembled a fantastic group of advisors, not just internal folks, but experts in the field that were in other areas of business that could advise us on how to go about allocating those funds. And that was critically important to know that we were not only going to invest them, but we were intentional about who was at the table informing us on how to invest that money, where to invest that money. And so that was one of the major initiatives that we have done. In addition to that, Warner Music Group, I think they did a good job by hiring me. They brought me over as the global head of diversity. They had not had a position at that level, reporting to the CEO. And then they gave me the resources to build out a team. And that's what I've been doing since my arrival. 1 year next month, August 17th is when I started there. And so I think they invested, number one, because you don't want to have external investment and not mirror that internally, right? And so they have to be congruent. There's nothing worse than you doing what would be considered virtue signaling at that point. If you're giving externally, but your employees internally are having a terrible experience. And so bringing me on board to ensure that the culture, the fiber of our organization matched and mirrored who we were projecting ourselves to be in regard of that social justice fund, a $100 million foundation. Those are the significant strides that Warner has taken early on.
I'm going to now turn to Ms. Chanel Hardy, who is our second panelist and the head of the Civil Rights Strategic Outreach and Partnerships Lead with Google. Chanel Hardy is an attorney and public policy expert dedicated to advancing policies that promote economic growth, opportunity, and justice. She is a member of the public policy team of Google, focusing on strategic outcomes. strategic outreach, and external partnerships. Most recently, she had the honor to serve as Chief of Staff to the Federal Communications Commission, and the first woman to serve as the commission chair and the only African-American currently on the dais. Before that, she led the Washington Bureau of the National Urban League, the nation's oldest civil rights and urban advocacy organization, was counsel and chief of staff to former U.S. Congressman Arthur Davis, and served as the FTC staff attorney, fellow and counsel at Consumers Union, and a fifth grade teacher. She is a member of the board of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies and the Black Women's Health Imperative. Welcome, Mrs. Hardy. And I'm going to ask you the same question, given the context of what you heard earlier and also what's happening in our nation over the last 2 years, what initiatives has your organization taken, both externally and internally, to sort of address what we've been seeing recently?
Thank you, Kimberly. Let me just say I'm honored to be part of this conversation with you. Your background and the work you've done is just crazy impressive. We're so fortunate to have you on the front lines for our community, and Dr. Sinnett as well. Great to hear about your work, and congratulations on passing your year mark. My bio is a little old, so I'll just say when I was at the commission, which was about 5.5 years ago, I worked for Mignon Clyburn, a name many of us know. She's no longer on the dais, but she was the first woman to serve as chair and the first Black woman to serve as a commissioner. So that was a great honor. In terms of what we're doing, I'll highlight a few things, because I am proud to say that while we certainly are in a process of growing and improving, and so there's much more to be achieved, we have been doing a lot over the years, and so I'll just highlight a few things. One is this year, actually just about a couple of weeks ago, we released our annual diversity report, and the reason that's worth flagging is we were the first Silicon Valley company to make our workforce demographic data public. And so I can say more about the results of that later in the conversation, but I'll just say that we did kind of set the standard for transparency on workforce in Silicon Valley, and we've been releasing it every year since then. Last year, like many other companies, we did make some specific racial equity public commitments. I'm very proud they came out from our CEO himself, and really were a combination of recognizing and elevating efforts that had been going on in the company, and also his personal journey and reflection around the nature of the struggle for civil and human rights in the US. So a couple of things. One is last year was when we officially committed to spend $1 billion annually with diverse suppliers, which obviously is super important for economic impact. We made specific commitments around racial equity, so committing to increase the underrepresented groups at Google, which are Black, Latinx, and Indigenous, in leadership representation by 30% by 2025, and also to expand our office presence in cities outside of the Bay Area, which is not necessarily a favorite place for folks in our community to move. And so we are spending many billions of dollars and creating 10,000 new jobs in places like Atlanta, Washington, D.C., New York, Detroit, Chicago, and Houston. So I'll stop there. There's more I could say, but I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you. Thank you both. And so while it's clear that both your organizations have done some tremendous work and are moving in the right direction, we've seen over the last couple of years, as a consequence, sort of the validation of sorts of Black Lives Matter, as people begin to sort of get on board and push that message. Cities were authorizing the usage of property and streets to put this message on the streets, and it's just become it's just been great to see that folks are getting behind and understanding now the message around Black Lives Matter. However, we have to wonder, given things that have happened previously, protests that have happened, how we've responded, whether what's happening now is that movement that we like to see, a continuation over decades and centuries, versus just the moment. People are sort of responding to what's been happening right now. So my next question is, how can we ensure that the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement continues to be a topic that our country and the world at large cares about in the coming months and years? And how can we be able to distinguish between sort of whether we've truly graduated from the current moment to sort of an ongoing movement. And this time, Ms. Hardy, I'm going to start with you.
It's a great question, and the answer will be more than I probably give immediately. But one thing I will say that I have found most heartening about what began with the marches of the Black Lives Matter movement is the way it transitioned into specific civic engagement and voting. As someone who worked in policy for a civil rights organization for many years, you know, I recall when, you know, my friends would say, marching, nobody does that anymore. It's like, well, we still do in the civil rights movement. It's been great to see some of those tactics that are kind of tried and tested have come back. But then the next step is to get into voting. And I also remember conversations with folks, we may recall a dramatic difference in, and there's a whole rabbit hole we could go down, but kind of the difference between presidential election voter turnout and off-cycle or, you know, midterm election turnout. And we'd seen some things that were kind of disappointing and had conversations about it. And kind of the challenge we thought we were facing is people don't see voting as the exciting part of activism and engagement. And so to see the way that regardless of who folks are voting for, that we had that unprecedented turnout at the polls last year, ongoing organizational efforts, and for our company, we actually joined in Q1 of this year, the Business for Voting Rights Coalition to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, designed to address the dismantling of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And so to be part of, I think the group is now 160 plus companies that are calling for that type of national solution, I think is the type of metric that shows, you know, the movement for Black Lives really is here to stay.
All right, thank you. So Ms. Hardy has demonstrated that she feels like that it is a movement, that this will not be a moment, but I do want to get your perspective, Dr. Stinnett, in terms of whether you believe this is going to be the ongoing movement that we hope for, or whether we are already sort of seeing signs of this maybe just being the moment.
Thank you, Kimberly. Great question. And I love what Ms. Hardy said too, very insightful. I want to start off by saying Black Lives Matter. That is an unequivocal truth. So I don't see it, Kimberly, as my job to convince people of my humanity or the humanity of Black people. I'm in the business, though, of fighting for policies, practices, and systems to reflect care for all Black people, right? That they don't do harm, that they don't exclude or work against us even, and just get out of the way and let us thrive. I think that's where we must continue to push and to ensure long-term sustainable change. Now, in terms of how we gauge graduating from a moment to a movement, I want to be clear that when I talk about this, I'm referring to non-Black people, because Black people have been in this as a movement since before we called it that. We've always known of our humanity and gifts, and we've always resisted those who tried to describe and treat us otherwise. For when the first people were captured in Africa, they fought back. To the rebellions and uprisings during enslavement, to thriving out of, to us thriving out of this terror, white terror during the Reconstruction, to the Civil Rights Movement. We've been a movement time and time again, right? So for the non-Black people, and especially white folks, to graduate from a movement, not just a moment, it's going to take a couple of things. Number one, it's going to take them giving up things consistently and en masse, giving up power, ownership, and control, both materially and emotionally, giving up their investment in lies, in their denial of the facts that this is not a racist country that they benefited from. And then that giving up does what? It creates space. So it doesn't just create space for Black faces at tables of power and influence, but it creates space for what? Imagination, for creativity, for new ways of doing and being that are more equitable for all, for places that just don't tolerate or accommodate Blackness, but celebrate and are rooted in our visions, culture, and brilliance. That's how I would answer that.
Amen.
That was a great answer. I'm sad that I was not second.
Yeah, totally. And I'm sorry, did you want to share something else, Ms. Hardy?
Oh, no, I was just saying, I just totally agree with everything that Dr. Sinet said. It was just very eloquent.
Yeah, and that is sort of, I think, the resistance that we're seeing now, all the resistance, the pushback. These organizations that have probably been in the shadows for years that are now coming out are coming as a consequence, because I think they see that there is a movement afoot. Clearly, there's some movement happening, because when you're not making movement, then you don't see this kind of pushback and resistance. So I guess we can look for more of that, because I also believe that this is a movement, and at this point, there's no turning back. It really is not. And also, I just want to reiterate what you said around the giving up of power is critical. And I think that's why we're seeing the resistance. Folks who have benefited from that level of power for years are now fearful that they will lose that. And as such, they're taking it to the streets as well. So this resistance is sort of counter to the movement, but the movement will not stop. So I appreciate that. Thank you. We saw that, as a consequence of George Floyd's death, there was a lot of organizations and corporations who were putting out statements and in solidarity, and even some who went so far as to say that they both support the anti-racist movement, racism movement, but also that their organizations were anti-racist, which is really interesting to me, because although I work with a group of people who get it, for the most part, terms like anti-racism had not been used up to that point. So the language is shifting, it's evolving. People are using words that they had never used before. And it is an acknowledgement, sort of like you said previously, Dr. Sinet, that this exists and people have to actively sort of resist that. I want to give both of my panelists an opportunity to sort of share how your company has incorporated some inclusive practices, both in the workplace. Ms. Hardy, you said you released that data. We want to hear a little bit more about that, but also how have you used your own platform and position to advocate for reform? And I'll start with you, Ms. Hardy.
Not again. No, I think a couple of things, because you asked a few questions there. So in terms of practices at a company level, yes, this was the year that we had our best results on hiring Black and Latinx employees. And I think, as the liaison for our company with the civil and human rights community, this reflects, the wisdom and the guidance that the community has consistently offered to corporations over the years. And that is that leadership really does need to come from the top. There's often really good work happening at many levels throughout the company, but you have to have the leaders who are driving the rest of the company priorities to really define the priority as such. And so I think our racial equity commitments and making them publicly really helped our team to hold folks' feet to the fire and to produce those results. At the same time, we still have work to do. We continue to have attrition with folks who come into the company, do good work and then move on instead of always staying with us. And so we want to continue to make efforts to really make Google a place where, regardless of your background, you feel that you belong and that your contribution is valued, so that this can be a place where you can build your career. In terms of my platform, I think that part of why I came to Google from the a career in civil rights and in government was because the power that corporations really do wield in our day-to-day lives, and recognizing the opportunity to impact the community just by doing my job well. And so one of the things that we were able to do as a result of the real work that the activists did around Black Lives Matter was to really put some solid infrastructure around our commitment to civil and human rights. So for example, our Alphabet Board of Directors now has direct oversight over our civil and human rights program. We have a Human Rights Executive Council where executives across the company are regularly receiving reports and providing insights and strategies so we can ensure that the work never is siloed, and so that we can really have the capacity to ensure that as we're developing products that impact people's lives, that we're able to ensure that they promote and advance civil and human rights. And one example of kind of how the rubber meets the road is really just around the role of platforms themselves. I mean, when we think about what started as kind of the Ferguson hashtag all the way into Black Lives Matter. You know, the level of debate we're having, the level of engagement we're having really was buttressed by what we could do online, by the fact that we could record video of excessive force and share it. It can no longer be a matter of word of mouth only. And so this is something that, you know, we work really hard. I'm personally invested in protecting at the same time that we ensure that platforms aren't a vehicle to spread hate. And so it is a extremely urgent conversation that the community is involved in, but I think it is really going to help define the future of the work and the movement.
Thank you. And so, Dr. Stinnett, I would like to build sort of on what Ms. Hardy said around the importance of having leadership on board, the idea that they have to sort of lead the charge for others to, first of all, get the signal that there's a change afoot, and also to understand that this is something that they support. But the most elusive thing that she mentioned was this idea around culture. And you mentioned culture earlier, and how culture plays such a critical role. Like, you can get people in the doors. Diversity is simple, right? That's easy to get folks of different hues and colors and ethnicities to the door, but then keeping them there, that retention component. So I'm hoping you could share with us some of your insights and things that maybe you've done in your corporation or in your previous practice around changing culture so that people know it's real, as well as how your company, or both you individually, have used that platform to signal that there's a change and we support that change.
Excellent. So how have we shifted the culture in the organizations I've been in, and what have I done from my platform or the organization? Let me start with what I've done. Anytime I enter a space and any leaders, I tell them that number one, you have to have courage, and you have to have courage to speak truth to power in those situations. There's too many people I've seen in my role that lack courage to say the truth, to tell the truth, to disrupt and shake the boat and rock the boat, whatever you want to call it. And that's just problematic, because nothing is going to get done or changed if we don't speak truth to power. And in shifting culture and speaking that truth to power, I always tell every company that decides they want to hire me that you need to sign up for and be prepared for healthy disruption, because that's what's going to change this culture. Your privilege has allowed you to be comfortable, right? And you don't want to be uncomfortable. You don't want to be inconvenienced. You don't want to be challenged. And so if you don't want to be challenged, inconvenienced, and uncomfortable, don't call me, because that's what's going to require of you to shift and change this culture. Because those individuals who find themselves on the margins of your community, of your organization, have been uncomfortable for quite some time. And it's been quite all right with you, because you haven't been. And so in doing so, it's that's number one, level setting the expectations, that this is not going to be some kumbaya moment that we're all going to get along and it's going to feel good, right? Everything that's good for us doesn't feel good. And I level set those expectations. You're not going to feel good during this process, but doing good oftentimes requires us not to always feel good about. When I hit this gym this morning, I didn't feel good about hitting that gym, but my body at the end of the day will benefit from it. So I think that's number one, really level setting those expectations when you enter into the space of what it's going to require of us to change the culture is what I'm getting at. You have to understand what it's going to require, and that's going to be healthy tension is what I tell everybody. We've got to sit in the healthy tension of what's going on, what's happening. Number two, from my vantage point, what am I doing? Continuing to speak truth to power. I have to be honest in the role that I am. I'm a truth teller. I have to be in this role. If I'm not, then I'm irrelevant. You have to speak truth to power, but then provide a pathway. It's just not about shining the light on what everybody knows, but what's the pathway out of the dark? How do we get you from A to Z? And so my job is also then to outline a roadmap, to lay down a roadmap on how we're going to get there. So I would say level setting expectations, ensuring that the leadership knows that it's going to require you to be uncomfortable. And in the position I'm in for my platform, you have to have the courage to speak the truth and to hold, as I say, hold the line and maintain and move forward.
Amen. All right. Thank you. And so my next question really goes to sort of what we see in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Is the area that's home to over a dozen Fortune 500 companies, including 3M, General Mills, and Target. And in the last few years, this area has also become the headquarter region of this racial hostility and police brutality that we've seen with the murders of Philando Castile, which started in 2017, George Floyd, of course, in 2020, and then Daunte Wright in 2021. For decades, corporations in cities like Minneapolis have formed these national partnerships to address unemployment, education, housing, health, all these various sectors and the disparities that go along with that. While some of these efforts, of course, have produced some substantial results, many have not moved the needle for the local Black communities in that area. So have your companies seen success in public-private partnerships to support your local communities versus tackling sort of the national agenda that we see? And I'm going to start with you this time, Dr. Stinnett.
Great question, Kimberly. Let me start off by saying I'm a firm believer that people are the experts on their own lives and communities. I think too often corporations expect that people and communities to perform, produce, and to provide solutions using the terms and means that the corporations think are the best. And that's just paternalistic and frankly racist. How can you presume that you know what's best for a community that you've never been a part of? That's why I'm excited. What have we done? I'm excited to be a part of Warner Music Group and the Blavatnik Family Foundation Social Justice Fund. We specifically created this fund in wake of the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor to build a more just and equitable communities with a focus on Black people and communities. And so instead of us launching programs to solve the problems we identified, we simply said we need to trust and invest in Black-led organizations to tackle what they see as most urgent using the methods they think are the most appropriate, right? And that's the key, engaging them in their way, where they're at, what's the most appropriate, what tools they have, what resources, providing just more resources to take it to scale. And then finally, when we think about measuring change, Kimberly, or moving the needle, one of the things I'd really challenge us all in corporate spaces to think about is whose outcomes are we measuring? What does a substantial result look like for a mother or father of a Black child in Minneapolis, for a Black teenager in St. Paul, for an aging retiree? How are we doing according to them is my question.
Yeah, and I think that's a component often even advocates miss, like they're doing the work that they feel is right. But when I ask how are you measuring success, how do you know that you've reached that outcome? That's where they tend to fall short. So that's very critical. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to turn to you, Ms. Hardy, because you're an attorney, you do policy advocacy. And so Dr. Stinnett brought up a really critical point around the folks who have the most knowledge, the people who know what they need are the people who you say you want to help. And so I just really like to hear how your company has got involved in any public or private partnerships that support local communities in their efforts.
So two thoughts there. I mean, I think one is, of course, money, which I'll get to. But I think one of the things that I tend to get excited about, and I've been at the company for getting perilously close to 6 years now. And I remember when I first arrived, the tech sector was still a place where folks generally were like, it's exciting what they're doing over there. We're not exactly sure what it all is, but it's exciting and it has potential to make our lives better. Certainly that whole premise is up for discussion, as it should be. But there are still some things about tech and about my company in particular that inspire me. And so whenever we can do things that involve our products, I think it's a great place to start. And so one of the things that we launched a few years ago with the conversation about future of work, us and many others were really starting to talk about what happens in a future where more and more jobs are digitized. And certainly that's a conversation that is now, was rapidly accelerated over our being stuck at home for many of us that were non-essential being stuck at home, is how do we answer the ask that we get from the community around what are the skills we need? What are the trainings that we can take to increase our options for careers, whether we're talking about young people, adult learners, folks who are in career transition. And so Grow with Google is an initiative that we launched that really said, let's take all of the different tools that we have, let's put together trainings on them, Some of them just, you can be a 5-minute video you can watch on your phone, all the way through, real comprehensive workshops. There's, specific tracks for small businesses, for teachers, for students, kind of name what your interest is. And we decided to partner with the experts, which are the nonprofits all around the country. They can join and become a Grow with Google partner and get, real partnership around what does it look like to provide these resources to your community? What trainings can we do together? And so we partnered with some great organizations, including many of the chambers of commerce, the U.S. Black Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Hispanic Chamber, to really say, particularly you can imagine at the beginning of the pandemic, let's quickly help you get your businesses online so that folks have a fighting chance when their doors are closed. So that's one example. And since we launched Grow with Google, we have helped 170,000 people land in new opportunities based on that digital skilling. But then on the other side of the equation, resources, I certainly have spent much of my career, as I'm sure Dr. Sinnett has, and you have, where the conversation talks around money, but ultimately access to capital continues to be an issue for our community. And so we have a Black Founders Fund where we've been giving non-dilutive funding to founders to really help them to grow their businesses. But another fund that we started that I thought was, it turned out to be just particularly timely, was an investment of $180 million in the Opportunity Finance Network, which is the trade association for the community development financial institutions, which are those lenders that provide resources to the smallest businesses, those who would probably not get funding through traditional channels. In fact, most of these are exactly the folks who didn't benefit from those PPP loans. So we were excited to kind of be ahead of the curve on that, so that these dollars were able to be lent to folks who needed that at a tough time.
All right, thank you. I want to now turn to sort of the response on the federal level to what occurred as a consequence of the murder of George Floyd. Even the boldest of corporations will be unable to effectuate real change if they don't work hard or hand in hand with politicians to advance the policies that were necessary. I think Dr. Sinnett mentioned this earlier. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020, which would establish a registry of police misconduct complaints and require federal uniformed officers to all wear body cams, has cleared the House, but hasn't yet passed the Senate. I just want to know if either of your corporations or organizations have demonstrated any support for this act. And if or if not, just if you have any personal, comments around whether you feel like this act was a good move on the federal level in terms of trying to address sort of what we saw as a consequence of what happened with Mr. Floyd. And I want to turn to you again first, Dr. Sinnett.
Yes, and so in light of that, it's so interesting when that was happening and the conversations were taking place and it was going through all the process. I had several of the executives, Black executives, music executives, reach out to me and said, what is our position as Warner Music Group? What are we doing? How are we going to leverage our brand, right? Because we know most of the music that drives a culture, that informs a culture, that shifts the culture is Black music. So how can we then sit back passively and not engage in what's happening to Black bodies as Black executives in this industry? I thought that was profound. Very, very pleased that they reached out to me and held my feet to the fire to that. So what I did immediately was curated a conversation with our senior leadership, Black team across the globe. And I brought in Paul Henderson. Paul Henderson actually is the executive director for an organization out in San Francisco about police reform. He literally works on that. That's been his focus. He's amazing. He also sits on our Social Justice Fund board. And it's a very complicated conversation, understanding the legislation, et cetera, but really getting down to the bottom line is, what can we do as Warner Music Group as an organization to move this thing forward? And so first thing I want to do is educate my folks. Let's understand the issue. Let's understand what they're talking about. Let's see it from every vantage point, right? And then once we're well informed, we can make a better decision on how we can lean in and leverage our brand and power. So we're actually going through that journey right now, having these informational sessions. He's training and teaching us about the history, the law, the legislation, what's been proposed. What does that really mean? How does that impact people on the ground level? And then now we're going to go to phase 2, is being thoughtful of what do we do now that we've been armed with the proper information? Where is it appropriate for Warner Music Group to lean in at? So I don't want to pretend right now that we have that answer, but we are on the road. And I'm happy to say at least we're having the conversation and understand the responsibility that we have to engage in moving those types of things forward. And so that's where we're at. And personally, it's very personal to me. I'm Black. That could happen to me, all right? The reality is when I'm walking down the street, running out in my neighborhood with my hoodie on, nobody knows I'm Dr. Stinnett, working for the global head for Warner Music Group, went to 2 Ivy League schools. They don't give a damn about that. They see me as a threat, right? As the one person said so eloquently, how can I be unarmed when my Blackness is the threat, is the weapon that you fear, right? And so here it is, here I am suspended in that reality. And so I have to be committed to this because I am never unarmed to a fearful white person who sees my Blackness as the weapon that is potential harm to them. So anyway, I'm personally invested, but so pleased with my Black colleagues at Warner Music Group that reached out to me and said, Stinnett, we got to do something. So now my position is always, let's be thoughtful, let's be educated, and then let's execute. So that's what we're doing right now.
All right, so I'm going to turn to you, Ms. Hardy, but also, you know, with your background experience and having done policy advocacy and understanding that at times, even our suggested changes may not be enough or may not even hit the right spot. I would just be interested in hearing your perspective around whether this measure that both requires body cams and this police registry, you think that will help sort of move the needle or in any way stop some of what we're seeing?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it is a piece of the solution, and I think it is a bold piece. I also think part of what we have not taken a formal position on the legislation. Part of that is because I, as kind of the internal champion for the civil rights work and groups, what I often remind people is that, you know, Google is a relatively new company. Before we were around, these organizations were on the front lines of this work. And when we, you know, perhaps shift our priorities, they will still be there. And so the most important thing for us to do is ensure that we are close to these folks who are on the front lines, whether that's providing funding, whether that's providing volunteer resources, whether it's just making sure that we have a ongoing dialogue and communication. And so we defer in terms of positions in many cases to what the community is asking of us. And as you know, there are a lot of quite urgent civil rights priorities in front of the legislators right now. And so we want to be thoughtful in our response. Part of why we joined the Business for Voting Rights Coalition was in response to what the community was asking us to do. But I will say this, and this is a point of pride, we have been long-standing funders of criminal justice reform work, including the Center for Policing Equity's whole, you know, tracking map and all of that, really supercharging that with AI. But we actually funded the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights a few years back when they developed the research that led to the principles underlying the bill. So that's an example of how we can be, you know, part of the solution. Even as we wait for more guidance from the community about the best way to engage. We always want to make sure, you know, of course, we're in a polarized climate. Sometimes, you know, our voice makes things better and sometimes it doesn't. So we really want to be really thoughtful about following the guidance of experts.
All right, thank you. So as we get prepared to close, I have one final question. And there was a 2021 study that reveals 76% of those surveyed believe that a company doesn't have to be perfect when talking about social justice issues, but it should be open and honest. Dr. Stinnett talked about truth telling. In what ways can companies exemplify their values for humility and honesty over this ideal of perfection? And I'm going to start with you, Ms. Hardy.
I think this is a day-by-day decision to be open and honest and authentic. I think that it is easy and a kind of natural reaction when there's criticism to kind of retrench. And instead, I think what I've appreciated about this movement is really not only companies deciding to say, like, let's be introspective and let's be public about that introspection in many ways, but also to share with employees. We've talked a little bit about how our employees want a place where they feel that they belong. And we know that for millennials in particular and Generation Z, they're often looking for workplaces that are consistent with their values and would even be willing to take a paycheck in order to do a pay cut in order to do that. So we see kind of the first step in our accountability as being our internal colleagues, but then beyond, the example of sharing our diversity annual report is one. Engaging with stakeholders at the highest levels of our community is another. But I also would say, as an advocate, some of this is also about what the community demands, right? Companies listen to the public and take cues from the public. And so just like we have begun this effort as a community to ask corporations and the government to be responsive to our concerns, we have to continue that. That will never be Coretta Scott, King's famous quote, the work of justice is never ended. And so I think that it's a challenge both for us and corporations to hold ourselves accountable, and it's a challenge for the community to continue to ask that we do that.
Yeah, and I think, it's sort of clear to me that Google is definitely taking those steps and sharing that information and being so transparent and open and honest, but also being willing to say that, we're still struggling around culture, and we're struggling in terms of what that means for the retention of the folks that we bring in. So we appreciate you bringing that honesty to this discussion, Ms. Hardy. So I'm going to turn to you. What ways can companies exemplify their value for humility and honesty over this idea of perfectionism?
Again, that's a great question. And Kimberly, to me, humility is a practice. It's about companies continuously striving to do and to be better, right? And this means we've got to be open and vulnerable enough to accept critique and criticism, to be called in when we don't get it right, because while our intentions are important, we can still do harm with our impact. And we know there's a difference between intent and impact. And that starts with leadership, Kimberly, displaying these characteristics and this practice of humility, being transparent, being honest when we are unsure or when we've screwed up, creating spaces where people feel comfortable offering correction, right? We need to have grace for corporations, for our leaders and for ourselves, but we also need to have high expectations, because this is people's lives and communities who are harmed when we don't get it right. I often tell the folks at Warner that, listen, DEI is a journey, not a destination. We're constantly growing and evolving as people and organizations, but we've got to have the courage to do our best and then care to do better. Simply put, it's what my favorite person, Dr. Maya Angelou, said: do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better.
All right, that's a great ending. I appreciate that, Dr. Stinnett, and thank both of you guys for sharing your journey, your stories, and the experiences of your corporations with us. I just want to end by sort of reiterating some of the things that have been said, this idea of speaking truth to power, this idea of giving corporations grace, but requiring them to have high expectations. I really appreciated Mrs. Hardy's continuous demonstration that it's important that you follow the lead of the community, those that you intend to impact and help. If you're not following their lead, if they're not involved in the conversation around how to make the change, then you oftentimes are going to fall short. I love the idea of healthy disruption, healthy tension, And what it says is that this is a long-term journey, that when we talk about DEI, the concept, the ideas around DEI, we're talking about making a long-term ongoing commitment. This is not something that you can commit to and expect results in a very short period of time. It's something that you have to commit to on an ongoing basis. It's almost like a marriage. Once you tie the knot, and let no man take us under, right? And so with that, I think someone said that people are the experts of their own lives. Let's continue to follow the lead of the communities that we serve and continue to do the great work of expanding that. And I think consumers have to hold these corporations accountable, and both give them grace while they are speaking their truth, but also having high expectations of them. And so with that, I hope that this movement that we've been talking about continues to be that and not be a moment. Thank you.